Hi everybody. I hope you'll have fun. We're going to see some outrageous stuff. and there's some things that are at the cusp of what I think is the most damaging types of deception that's going on in our society. We'll start with the really bad, obviously kind of ridiculous stuff, but we'll get to things that are a little bit more difficult, that require a more trained eye to figure out why they are deceptive and how harmful they are. I'll try to speak for about half an hour or so, show you examples, run through a lot of great examples, but I'll try to organize them so that we'll see the kind of deception and the kind of false information that is being disseminated, and then we can talk about some of the things, maybe more controversial things that I will suggest are deceptive. So please feel free to get questions ready as soon as I'm done. I'll try to leave a lot of time for discussion. So the first thing I want to show is outright food fraud, things, literally false claims that are said and that are misleading. I'm going to start with this example. I try to embed the actual commercial. This is Kellogg's mini wheat cereal, frosted mini wheats. It says at the top, somewhere here, clinically shown, substantiated, right, to increase kids' attentiveness by 20%. So then I put on this, but it didn't work, so I'm going to jump here for a second and show you where did I put this? Here. Show you the actual commercial.
Where were we? We were on the third paragraph of page 57, and you were explaining that the stone structure was made by ancient Romans and called aqueducts, and as a rat now on the board, the chalk broke. And it's in pieces. Right.
I've never been so proud.
Filling breakfast and frosted mini cereal can improve their attentiveness by nearly 20%.
20%? Okay, even I'm impressed by it.
Keeps them full, keeps them full.
Wow, huh? Shown, clinically shown. And close this, go back to our. So yeah, they're saying that it's clinically shown to improve children's attentiveness by 20%. Cereal can't do that, right? The so-called study compared kids eating mini wheats to kids not having any breakfast at all. Imagine how much more they would do if they ate, I don't know, Cheerios or something like this. There were immediate class actions filed, the FTC actions, or namely the Federal Trade Commission tried to stop, and Kellogg stopped the thing and settled and paid money to get the lawyers, the class action lawyers. The FTC can't get compensation for that, but they can get an injunction. Another example that I find outrageous is Wonderful pomegranate juice that has burst into the scene about a decade and a half ago with enormous claims about the value, health value of drinking pomegranate juice. Now, pomegranate juice is good for you. It's full of nutrients and vitamins, but it has not been shown to do the kind of things that they are saying that it does, like I'm off to save prostates, there's prostate health, or heart therapy, good for cardio health. And they've made these claims by saying that in their ads, new research offers further proof of the heart healthy benefits of pomegranate. 30% decrease in arterial plaque. Only Pom Wonderful is backed by $31 million in clinical research. That's a strong statement that is, as you'll see, not substantiated. The FTC sued POM for consumer fraud, for making false claims. POM presented at the trial 3 studies that were made. Yes, they did try to get researchers all over the world. They poured money of them to do studies and to see how the studies did not show. One of the 3 studies showed a very, very weak, non-statistically significant, not valid in any meaningful way to substantiate the claims, very small effect. The others had no statistical significant effect on the kind of claim that POM makes. And in the Federal Court of Appeals in Washington said that this is fraudulent, deceptive, has to stop, and that if they want to make such claims, it has to be substantiated by evidence that is produced from a randomized clinical trial. Expensive to do, but if you want to make health claims, treat it like a drug. We have to show that it works. So these are 2 examples for outrageous, literally false claims. Now I'll show you a few examples that are still false according to our law and not allowed, but the falsity is a little bit more subtle. It's by the implication of what's being said. And that is, this is a label that's produced by the American Society of Nutrition. It's a trade group of Kellogg's, Dean Foods, and a few others. And it has nothing to do with nutrition per se and health. But they developed this Smart Choice program label that they decided to put on foods like Fudgesicle, Fruit Loops is a smart choice. Kellogg's Pops is a smart choice. Potato chips is a smart choice, and many others. And there were immediately lawsuits filed because that seemed so outrageous. State attorney generals, FTC, FDA, private class actions, and they immediately stopped it. This American Society of Nutrition announced that it was postponing the program. Now, it's not as, you have to, what's wrong with saying smart choice? It's not really a claim. What's the difference between Red Bull gives you wings, or Mueller's generic pasta is America's favorite pasta, or Papa John is better pizza? Everybody understands it when they say it. It's not substantiated. It's not better pizza. It's not America's favorite pasta. And Red Bull doesn't give you wings. So smart choice, what's wrong with it? Isn't it just what we call puffing that all advertising does? No, because it conveys different information, it suggests to consumer psyche something different. And that is, that's a claim that I'm making and that the industry surrendered to. And it has to be proven through surveys. And when people see this, they interpret that to be facts, information, that this is a smart, nutritious choice. So these are examples of outright food deception that have been determined in courts to be actionable and expensive for the industry to have made, they had to stop it. The second, the more interesting category is misleading information. It's not literally false, it's what the doctrine of unfair competition and false advertising calls impliedly false. Literally true, but likely to mislead. And this is, I want to give you a few examples and walk through things that are, first, obviously likely to mislead, and others that are more controversial. So here is a juice. This is Coca Cola's brand, Minute Maid juice that that's called pomegranate blueberry juice blend. And there's a big picture. It's very cheap to put a big picture of pomegranate and blueberry. It's much more expensive to extract that juice. The generic cheap juices are apple and grape, and indeed in this juice they exist. And you know what percentage? What percentage is apple and grape in this pomegranate raspberry juice? Okay. You know, right? 99 point something. There is this much on the right bottle of pomegranate and raspberry, and the rest is apple, grape, and food coloring. And that's why they can't call it raspberry, pomegranate blueberry juice. They call it pomegranate blueberry juice blend, so as not to mislead. But there's so much misleading. Here's an analysis that I can show you. But it says supports brain and body. No, it does not support brain and body in any meaningful way. It's not a pomegranate blueberry juice. It is an apple grape juice, as says in the back label. That's how we know that it has all that stuff. Here we had a lawsuit by the good guys, Palm Wonderful. Remember, the defendant from Prostate Health is now suing Coca Cola because Palm invested in creating a market for pomegranate juice. Everybody wants to drink it for cardiac health, right? But they now can get a Coca Cola, cheap Coca Cola juice. Instead of paying $8 for a small bottle, they can pay $3 for a large bottle that looks the same, big picture of pomegranates. So Palm is suing under the statute. It's called the Lanham Act, the Unfair Competition Statute. And it gets to the Supreme Court, and check that, the FDA files an amicus brief supporting Coca-Cola, saying they're fine. They're doing everything right. Why? Because the back label, behind the spine print, correctly declares the percentage content of the named juices, and it does call it a juice blend, which according to the misbranding regulation, blah, blah, blah. It's all fine with our regs, the FDA says. Should not be, POM should lose. The FTC, another federal agency that is in charge not of food and drug regulation, but of deception in general, says, no, this is misbranding, this is misleading, this is deception. And the Supreme Court decides that the FDA, that compliance with FDA labeling is not enough to prevent deception. And in fact, when we talk about misleading information, it's not the FDA's view, but the FTC view that counts. And POM wins against Coca Cola, and they have to stop using this kind of branding that is that it provides false information. So that's an example of literally false, but misleading. And here is, I'm now going to take yet another step away from the obvious mischief by the food companies and talk about things that are misleading in more subtle ways. And I have to start with the non-GMO part. This is a non-GMO labeling. This is a private label that's developed by stores and sellers of elite food, of upscale food, the Non-GMO project, and it certifies that it has to do with food that is produced from crops that are not produced through biotechnology, the genetic engineering in the lab. The background is that this is a politically charged issue in the US, all over the world. Here in the US, we allow the cultivation and sale of GMOs. Most of the world doesn't. The EU doesn't. But we had a big raging debate on whether it has to be labeled. And right to know laws popped up in many states, initially failed in referenda in Washington State, California, and a few other places, but eventually passed in Vermont, and were going to become law. Manufacturers of GMO-produced food had to label it. Congress then preempted that with a federal statute that requires GMO labeling, but the label produced with GMO engineering can appear just as a scannable link, something like this. Namely, it's kind of, I called it in some place a GMO whisper. You just have to whisper that you're not. So that's already kind of, not giving people really information, but I'm talking about a bigger problem of deception. The whole idea of labeling take a step back, because this is not conveying much information to anyone, what we see is the emergence of a voluntary label, not mandated by law, of non-GMO. If you can't identify the bad, so to speak, GMO, then identify the good, the non-GMO. Now that is deceptive. In a more subtle way, I want to argue, it is literally true. Food non-GMO is non-GMO. But does it convey information that is misleading to people? Look, Dean Food sells True Moo chocolate milk, not the healthiest food, but it does say no GMO. They have one good thing they can say about their rich chocolate milk, but they write in their website, we firmly believe genetically modified ingredients are safe, just as safe as foods made with ingredients from non-GMO crops. This has been studied extensively and judged safe by blah, 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 but they still label it. They still say that something that is irrelevant, they feel that it has to be labeled. The same Tropicana says, non-GMO verified. That's weird because there are no GMO oranges in the market. Have not yet been developed. It would be great because that would help solve a problem that is currently unsolved by science of disease in trees in Florida. You notice that orange juice has become more and more expensive in recent years. Crops are dying, and there might be solution from GMO, but we'll see. That's just a footnote. No GMO, Hunt's ketchup, no GMO in sight. Again, no GMO tomatoes in the market. So what are they talking about? The worst is this Himalaya fine pink salt. Non-GMO, you see it again there, the non-GMO verified. Well, salt is a mineral. It is not genetically modified. It cannot be genetically modified because it doesn't have genes to modify. So I call this deceptive. But what really got me angry is this ad that I saw arrive at home one day in the flyer. GMO is a no, these cookies a yes. Why? Because they are non-GMO, the chocolate chip cookies. You know, what are they saying? That chocolate chip cookies are good for you, but GMO is bad? Really? There is mountains of evidence. Just recently there was an article in Nature that looked at 6,000 articles, including all those that conducted trials, actual clinical trials in the field, to see if there's any difference in the result in terms of health effect of GMO food. And the conclusive result, without a single exception, is that they are safe. The National Academy of Science has no effect on human health, has ever been shown. The World Health Organization, not captured by big agra, not likely nor have been shown to present risk. The EU politically doesn't allow GMO crops, but the Commission issued this report that says no health, from all the studies, no health benefit has been, a health risk has been shown. So really GMO is a no. Food that can feed malnourished populations, provide health and immense environmental benefits to the reduce global deforestation. If you increase the yield by 25%, you need 25% less South American jungles to deforest in order to grow more food for a raising population. All these have to do with biodiversity and major environmental impact. That is a no. And I'm not even getting into golden rice that can save about 1 million people who are vitamin A deficient in developing countries from death and 250,000 kids from going blind every year. That's a no. And chocolate chip, politically correct chocolate chip cookies to overweight Americans, that's a yes. I call this deception. You know, I know I'm a little bit reaching out in terms of what is deceptive, but I think that this builds on consumer misperceptions and fuels it and creates and augments it. Can it be avoided by disclaimers? Well, look at this. I took out the milk jug from my fridge, and here's some photos. The front says, you see, our farmers pledge no artificial growth hormones. Good milk, no artificial growth hormone. Nobody wants to drink milk and kind of grow, you know. But the back says, wait, you see this asterisk? Asterisks are a very important legal consequence. In the back, the asterisk says, and again, you have a binoculars or magnifying glass to see it, no significant difference has been shown in milk from cows treated with or without RBST growth hormones. The Food and Drug Administration has determined there is no significant difference. So nobody reads the asterisks. That's the problem. In fact, I spent a couple of years of my life reading disclaimers in every area, not just on food. The fine print of everything. And I've read all the evidence in all these sectors about the effects of fine print on people. And wrote a book titled More Than You Wanted to Know. The effect of these disclosures. And outright, clear conclusion is it doesn't make a difference to people whatsoever. The fine print is never read. If it were read, it is never understood. If read and understood, it does not change people's behavior. And it only gives immunity by law. You cannot sue them then for not telling you, not disclosing, for committing fraud, for doing unconscionable things, because look, it was disclosed. Hence the long iTunes terms and conditions, and hence all these, yada yada legalese that's everywhere, that unbelievably the law attaches legal consequences to this thing that people just ignore. So you cannot solve front of the package deception with back of the package disclaimers and fine print. It's not going to work. Can it be avoided by the government should regulate the terminology? That's my last set of examples is to show that also doesn't, very hard to make that work. So let's think about the use of the terms organic, local, and natural. There's rampant use of these terms. If we just regulate, that you can only use it when it means what it should mean, then we solve the problem of deception. Well, organic is regulated. You see this on many foods, and you think that, that's probably good for you. No spray, no chemicals. You think so? Well, wrong. Why wrong? Because look at what the regulations say. There's a law passed in 1990, and the USDA regulates it, the Department of Agriculture. Organic, first of all, means only 95% organic. You can pour 5%, you can pour, gasoline into it. Which also, by the way, can be organic. But, the food, it doesn't have to be, there is 100% organic label, a separate one, but you rarely see it. The organic already does the work for people to convince them that there is some added quality, which is very questionable. You see, first of all, there could be organics from everywhere, imported from China, less supervision there, less supervision by the USDA on how it's grown in China. Why do you know exactly how it gets there? And of course, many times we get things that are questionably better, if at all. Synthetic ingredients don't count against the 5% permitted non-organic fat. You can put in synthetic as long as they are on the permitted list. Now, the permitted list, the national list, is determined by a USDA board. Majority of members on the board are corporate representatives, Dean Foods, Walmart, and the others. So there's a long, long list of synthetic ingredients, including very questionable ones, and of course all the food colorings that are synthetic, that are permitted. So it's not really that organic, So what? We get these corporate organics thing, cheap organic food at Walmart, that I actually tend to think is a good social phenomenon. More people can afford to eat food that is marginally better, rather than few people can eat food that is greatly better. Now we just have to see where the product of a lot times a small improvement is greater than a little times a big improvement. I believe in corporate organics, but it does not convey information to the people that they think it conveys, and it's a very questionable case. It's not a success story of labeling. And indeed, we do have organic Twinkies. If there is an example for something that should not be thought of as organic, should not be thought of as food. Twinkie is a food that never spoils, right? It means that maggots don't eat it. But it's organic. The next one is the locally grown. And you see it now, especially in kind of more upscale areas, more locally grown food. Now, who does not love a farmer's market experience? The peaches are tastier from Michigan. Everything is, you get to know the farmer that sells to you. I love the farmer's market. I shop there religiously. But I don't have any political aspirations to claim that this is morally superior. In fact, I think it is inferior. I think that the claims that this is good for society, to sell food to a farmer's market, are misguided. And that is an element that the local food movement obscures and deceives people to think otherwise. That if we had a local label, it would respond, and there is a request to regulate it so that when people say local, you know that it's indeed local, namely from the locality here and not the locality in Chile. Local label is, part of this whole movement of food miles that appeal to environmentally conscious locavores. It's like to feel that the food is brought to the plate with less consumption of energy, fossil fuel energy. But transportation is a small fraction of the energy produced in food. Production is far and away the big element. Home preparation, 25% is also a lot of energy goes in. Transportation is only 11%. Look, this is transportation, the lowest bar. Everything else accounts for the real, you get real saving if you do production right, processing right, retailing right. So farmers market might help you save a little bit on the transportation. Driving in a truck from Wisconsin rather than flying from Chile or from New Zealand saves energy, but it only has a very little room to save because it's only the transportation column. And let me remind you, at least 4 billion people in the globe live in areas with scarce water. So local food cannot be universalized. It, by definition, is for more lush places. If you think about food as a movement, as a social problem, not as, my own fun of cooking, that's why I like farmers market, but as a political question, then how could it even begin to be thought of as a universal solution? It is 4 times more energy efficient to buy grass-fed lamb imported from New Zealand than one raised locally. If you care about how many calories of fossil fuel go into the production of 1 calorie of food, you really want to eat imported food. Now, you should probably not eat lamb at all if you care about these things, and definitely should not eat red meat. But that's a different question about the environmental case for vegetarianism, which I'm happy to do another talk someday. Transportation is not the solution. It's like, you get the point. Last one I'm going to talk about is natural. The 100% natural, which is a very kind of live legal issue right now. So we have natural Cheetos, and natural goldfish, and natural, all the junk food, that you can imagine, just splash on it natural, and people will say, oh, it's good for you, and buy. So it's deception, right? It's kind of misleading people to say. But how do you regulate the term natural? What is natural? The problem is that consumers are confused and take natural to mean something more than it really is. Because obviously you see everything can be natural. And therefore there are now currently endless, dozens if not by now over 100 large class actions against different foods alleging that this is deceptive. It is deceptive to label it natural. They're mostly unsuccessful. Because, and I'll tell you why, sorry. They're unsuccessful because it's hard to define, to say that something is not natural. What is not natural? What is the definition of not natural? Not made by humans? Humans are part of nature. Is there any food that human did not intervene in? The most heirloom tomato did not exist until people bred it to look like that. Maybe they didn't use laboratories, but they've used intervention. Is that natural? If it's natural when human intervened for that, why is it not natural when they intervene to add a stabilizer extracted from some mine of some mineral? It's hard to define, to put a legal boundary about what is yes and what is not. So what are the solutions? Solution 1 is to try to ban unauthorized use, to try to figure out what is permitted and not, to regulate the meeting. And the FDA began 2 years ago a process of doing this late in the Obama administration to regulate natural. And they asked for public comments, and they got thousands of comments about what is natural. People really care about this. But again, the line is hard to draw, and they have stopped that process. They said they don't know. Before that, many class actions, federal courts said, we are staying the proceedings. We're stopping the proceedings so that the FDA can give us advice. And the FDA say, we don't know. So now the judges have to decide, and by and large, plaintiffs lose. I think that the FDA, I suggested in some op-ed the opposite solution, to open the floodgates. For the FDA to declare that natural has no specific meaning and can be used by anyone. The idea that this will end deception. If everything is natural, nothing is. If people see that a Twinkie is natural, they will stop believing the natural to do anything, and ultimately the value of deceiving consumers will be forgotten. So, mentioned 3 possible labels. We can talk about others that I think are deceptive, like whole grain cereal, whole grain snacks. It's not whole food, it's whole grain. It means that it has also the grain, also the parts, the healthy parts of the grain, but it doesn't tell you what proportion. It can be just itty bitty little. Free range. Michael Pollan has in Omnivore's Dilemma a great description of what is free range chicken like. Yes, they can go out from the ammonia cloud in which they otherwise are enclosed, but they never do. I think, still the free-range label is, so there is so much, almost every nickname that emits health and goodness and wholesomeness is deceptive. I'll stop here, and we talked about the outright, literally false things, and then the impliedly false, the things that are state and something, provide a message, claim to provide a message that is not correct and lead people to make false assumptions about the food that they are consuming. Be happy to engage in discussion now. Yes?
So if the Oregon tip is still the gold standard of organic, I wonder if you've looked at the transportation cost versus the 5% garbage in the USDA standard, that trade-off in terms of the effect on the environment and health. So let's say ordering it here.
As I showed you, I suggested that the transportation is a negligible element. It's not even clear if you think about it, and there's a great book called Just Food by McWilliams, in which he talks about, in the first chapter, about the local farmer. It actually looks at the data about what does local food in that chapter, what does local food save us or not. And he shows the computation that something that is transported from nearby does not even reduce the transportation cost. Driving a small truck with a little bit of produce is inefficient relative to a jumbo jet in Chile with a lot of stuff. But this whole computation, he says, is irrelevant because it's only 11%. If you manage to reduce the production cost by a significant amount, then you begin to, I think that all of this is a footnote. All of these questions, local food, transportation, organic, are a small footnote to the big question, the big effect on the environment of the food that we consume is the decision to eat red meat. It's it is the biggest environmental decision that we make. It's much more important than what car we drive. You drive a Hummer, but stop eating, reduce your red meat consumption by 50%, you will offset those. It does how much we fly, all the other things we eat are dwarfed by our decision to eat red meat, because red meat requires a lot of resources to produce, about 120 calories of fossil fuel for every calorie of food that we get, about 1,200 gallons of water for every burger you eat. It's very inefficient to the environment. It's destructive to the environment. So that's why, if we want to talk about the environment, let's not even talk about these things. We'll have to have a different conversation. Yes?
I apologize for my ignorance. I'm not very keen to the food portion of the FDA, but with the drug portion, there's lots of support in basically establishing the labeling. Is there not the same type of support or same support system when a large food manufacturer or company wants to develop a label so that they're staying within the lines to not decept, which would help the consumer in some of these lawsuits?
Yes, it's a very good question. You actually help. It helps inform the conversation of what's going on here. We started with claims about health benefits. Kellogg's mini wheats increases child's attentiveness by 20%. Palm Wonderful increases prostate health. These are claims about health benefits, and these are treated like drugs. The law now says, have been clarified lately, that foods that make these claims have to be substantiated by randomized clinical trials. Not the same procedure of all the trials that you have to go through for drugs in the same way, because the food is, after all, consumed for other benefits as well. But can't really do it unless it is substantiated, and very few foods have this kind of benefits. So they kind of wipes out the outright fraud that existed. And it occasionally still comes back. But what we get instead is this more subtle, but not less effective, claims splashed on the front of the package. Whole grain is everything. Every cereal now says whole grain. Now, whole wheat is, I think, as far as I know, better than eating enriched, artificially enriched white flour produced food. But whole grain is not whole wheat. But who knows? I think that for years, when my kids were little, I wanted them to eat whole grain wheat, good cereal, so I bought the whole grain Wheaties instead of, because it said whole grain. Then I read, it doesn't mean what it says. It doesn't mean what you think it says. So the problem now is with the claims that are not outright expressly stating health benefits, but insinuating ones.
I'm a little curious how much difference the labeling makes. I mean, I suspect that the reason people eat Cheetos is because it tastes good. And the reason people make unhealthy choices is because they want to. And in a world where people make unhealthy choices anyways, why not provide them with the sort of subjective pleasure of thinking that they're making a better choice than they actually are?
If it doesn't make an effect on people, then I think that I'm with you. Why not bundle into the experience of the nutrition experience also some kind of a dream, Disneyland of food. You kind of can imagine that eating the food of queens and princesses. But I think that it does make an effect. I did not bring evidence. The industry thinks that it makes an effect because it spends billions of dollars on advertising. So ultimately, it's hard to imagine that these things don't make an effect, that the non-GMO, that people are completely immune to the non-GMO. There are, by the way, a lot of studies on trying to figure out consumer psyche about why people are demanding non-GMO. There is no evidence that it's more expensive. It's kind of elitist food. Why do Americans increasingly are demanding non-GMO in the face of counter-evidence? So I'm worried about the fact that these claims are deceiving people. And it would be surprising if they didn't. I'll tell you why. There is deception in every sector, every type of product. There's deception deception or kind of overstating things. But I think people are particularly prone to trying to make good choices with the food that they eat. They care a little bit less. For example, all over the world, they care about GMO crops, but not GMO cotton. Why GMO corn is forbidden in China and GMO cotton is permitted? Because cotton you don't eat. There's something about food and something about the GMO food especially has been shown in psychological studies. When people take something in, they are more alert and attentive to what it is. And I think more prone to misleading claims by food makers. Yeah?
So I was a small-scale organic farmer who sold all of our produce locally for many years. And so I think a lot of this obviously hits very close to home with me. Like I've worked in these sectors and dealt with a lot of this labeling requirements and obviously also as a consumer as well. And I think like what you were talking about with local food and this sort of like idea of local food being better, being misleading, I disagree with that, and I find that problematic in that I can see what you're saying about the transportation aspect because that's such a smaller percentage of energy use, but in terms of all of these other ways, including flavor, which you mentioned, but also including nutritional quality and freshness, which is linked with nutrition, it just far exceeds. Plus, there are these whole other sort of like non-economic, more difficult to quantify like aspects of consuming food that was grown locally or by a person that you know or interact with, and there's this whole other like trust dimension with that as well. So I just wanted to sort of like bring that into the conversation and ask if you have any sort of like if you work with that from like an academic perspective or how it factors in to your work.
I entirely agree with everything you said about the values that surround the local food production and the small-scale distribution. And as I said, I think farmers market bring a lot of value to people that go there. I think the food tastes better. We agree that it's nice to get to know your farmer. It creates a network of, you know where your food comes from. You feel differently about the meal that you ate when the basket of produce came from the cooperative that you joined and the share that you got, and you get some, nice celery and radishes that I love that. And I think it does create some connections. It has a sociological flavor that intuitively I sense is there and is meaningful. I'm not a sociologist and I've not examined it. But what I try to say is that I don't think these benefits extend to an overarching political claim about what's right for society at large. I think that it is so much more costly to produce in terms of energy, and so unavailable to so many communities, the neediest communities that need better nutrition. Elite communities in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or Berkeley will eat well even if there were no farmers market. But it is the communities that don't eat well, that don't have access to these things. They're more expensive. Many live in, once you look beyond the US, they live in areas where you cannot grow things locally. So how can we make this into part of a manifesto for how the world should eat, how society at large should eat? That's where I say I'm consuming something for my own benefit and joining cooperatives and all sorts of things to do that. So because I value and I'm willing to pay for the privilege of eating this kind of food. But I don't want to make this into part of the political claim as to what's right and wrong in society. And since I am an environmentalist by, kind of a conviction, I think that the biggest question we have to ask is every calorie we take in, how many fossil fuel calories were used to produce it, and should make wiser choices about that. Eating local food, unfortunately, is not the prescription to resolve that particular issue according to the way I see it. Yes?
I have a question about the use of natural. That's something I spent a lot of time with. And I was just curious, you suggest the solution being open the floodgates, everything's natural. But I'm not sure that would not be further misleading, because someone might think that, we already see natural Twinkies, natural Cheetos. If natural is just on everything, who's to say that consumers won't just think, gee, wow, we've made such great progress, look at all this natural food, and then keep buying things based on a false belief?
Yeah, then you're right. Then my open the floodgates solution would collapse, would not work. I offered it as kind of a thought experiment. If you can't really, if the ban solution is so hard to implement because it requires line drawing that is really, how do you do it? How do you figure out? The FDA gave up on it. Maybe removing free for all would eliminate the deception because people will stop believing in it. And it's not clear that they will. Ultimately, I think people, if you see every single item in the supermarket aisle says natural, you ignore it. We need this information to distinguish products. And the less it is used as a distinguishing type of information, the less it will be then offered to consumers as a benefit. Now, I'm not naive to think that the industry will find something else. They can't use natural, they'll find something else to... Wholesome. Like the whole grain. They splash all sorts of, things that are, they write low fat on things that don't have fat anyway, or low sugar on things that don't have low sugar. So you buy something that's low fat and high sugar, and something that's low sugar and sugar-free and high fat. And in the end, you consume a lot of sugar and a lot of fat, but you think that you got everything low. So, they're smarter than us. But if consumer protection lawyers want to think about how to address these issues, we have to try to start to close the loopholes that do a lot of harm, that affect a lot of people and make people pay much more for things that they should not be paying more for. Yeah.
I have a question that's maybe slightly outside of the scope, but it seems like the reason that, or at least part of the reason why corporations put labels like this on there is because we ascribe value to words like real and organic and natural because of pop science that we read or conversations that we have, things like that. So like, how much of the solution do you think has to come from the regulation of the way we consume information and science separately from food regulation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question and a really hard one. And I've been wrestling with it and thinking about it over the last few years as I became interested in the non-GMO, the GMO debate. You know, I remember myself 7, 8, 10 years ago when I first said I'll teach a seminar on food law. And I said, I'm going to talk about GMO, and GMO is terrible. We'll show how terrible it is. And then I read the science, and I had this aha moment, and my whole view about it changed. I asked myself, why was I misled? Why was I misguided initially? And then over the years, I've been asking myself, why are people not being, why are so many people around the world are anti-GMO? What's driving this sentiment, this disgust from GMO food? And the disgust.
No, but it comes from mistrust.
The mistrust of GMO food. What's driving it? And the question, the way I, initially I thought, and I still think, there was a role to the green movement, Greenpeace, and others that disseminated false information. There was one study that showed that if you feed rats GMO corn, they get cancer. Of course, it wasn't a controlled experiment, and they fed rats that are known. It shows rats that are known to have high cancer rate. They would get cancer from anything you feed them. It was published and then withdrawn from the journal when it was realized how faulty. But that study is still the number one cited result, the number one result when you look for science on non-GMO. So it was groups like Greenpeace that kind of mind-boggling to me. Like, well, why a good, well-intentioned group would be advocating something. It is the equivalent. Many people have made this kind of advocacy to be the equivalent of climate denial. Just against science. But I don't think that they are responsible for it anymore. Right now, I think nowadays, the anti-GMO false sentiments are fueled by big food. They have picked up the baton was passed to them, and they're selling chocolate chip cookies that are a no, True Moo that is a no, Tropicana is non-GMO. They are both feeding on and feeding that misperception. And the more people see the non-GMO, Whole Foods made a pledge that everything will be non-GMO by the end of next year or something, the more people say, well, that must be a good, nutritious choice. Yeah.
Are you aware of any commercial efforts going on to kind of dispel this stuff about GMOs?
So there are I'm aware of non-profits. Yes, there are commercial efforts. There is a group that's called Peel Off the Label that's funded by a lot of big, bad companies that are not making non-GMO claims and feel that they are having a hard time competing with the ones that are lying. And so they are doing, but I don't think that has made any effect, any kind of impact on consumers' perception. There are, in many other areas of food quality and product quality in general, there are private groups that certify aspects of the food, like fair trade coffee. Fair trade is actually an important element of the social justice element in food production, how the peasants are treated in Central America, especially that's the areas that are being supervised in the production of the coffee, and how much child labor there is, how much they're getting paid, the quality. And so fair trade coffee is something that can be relied on because good groups are doing this, although that too, there's not deception, but that too, there's a lot of misperception. In fact, it turns out a student did a paper for me a few years ago. There are 10 groups that certify aspects of fair trade, and they disagree about the parameters. So how do I know when I go to Starbucks and I see one of these labels and to pay $3 more for 12 ounces of coffee that is fair trade when I buy it for home? How do I know that these are the things that I care about? Unless I go to their website and see what it is, or read my student's paper, see what it is that they certify. So they are not misleading anyone, but You see, here, the gist of the problem is that food is no longer, you're no longer biting into the apple. We're eating processed food. And processed food has a lot of components and ingredients and many ways in which it can be produced. It's all complicated. Food is complicated. It used to be simple, and like everything else in society, it's complicated. Cell phone plans are complicated, mortgages are complicated, investments are complicated, and food is complicated. For plans, mortgages, and investments, we get long disclosures, tens, if not hundreds of pages, to tell us the full information. We ignore them and, do our best. It turns out that for food, we need that much information too. And the only way to try to solve this is to rely on reliable intermediaries that will provide certification, labels that can be trusted. Not smart choice by the industry, but real labels. When the industry takes over and tries to produce a smart choice label, that dilutes the information and the reliability of the real good ones. And that's what needs to be protected, the integrity of good certificates and labels. Yeah.
Related to the previous question, I'm curious, how do you feel about GMO labeling on the other end, which would be a promotion of GMOs? Because I know some modern companies, comes to mind is a company named Soylent, which is like a meal replacement drink. They say proudly made with GMOs. So if there's no difference between GMOs and non-GMOs, is that deceptive to promote GMOs on the front of your...
Well, there is a difference between non-GMO and GMOs. GMOs, the production of GMOs creates an enormous social benefit. And if the claim is consume GMOs because you want to stand for what this technology is, what the technology does, you want to put your little vote for golden rice to be available to vitamin A deficient countries and for the production of food that requires less pesticides and insecticides and it's overall more healthier. If you want, then come buy our food. I think that's not deceptive. If that's what it stands for. You see, I go occasionally to Chipotle's, but I don't like to go there because I feel that this is a vote with my money for a company that is saying non-GMO. Right? I mean, they're lying in so many ways. First of all, they are GMO. The non-GMO is only the corn tortillas. The beef and meat and everything is fed with corn that is GMO fed. So there's lawsuits about that. That's outright lying. But the whole idea that Chipotle is the messenger of good environment is so grieving to me that I think I would like to know which companies are doing the opposite. Who proudly serve GMO golden rice in other countries where it can save lives, and therefore come buy for us here, even though you might not care about the food otherwise. I don't find that to be deceptive.
I think we're getting close to time, so thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for the talk.